Today's edition of MacVoices is supported by MacPaw, the maker of Clean My Mac X. Visit macpaw.com/podcast to download your copy and use the code MacVoices to save 5%. MacVoices is supported by LinkedIn Jobs. Find the right person for your business today with LinkedIn Jobs. Pay what you want and get $50 off your first job post at linkedin.com/MacVoices. Welcome to MacVoices. This is the talk of the Apple community, and I'm Chuck Joyner. This is part 2 in our series with Mike Potter, not of MacStock, but as a WordPress developer, talking about why WordPress is such a great choice for your website and why you can build it, or you might want to have somebody build it for you and give you the keys. A lot of different things here and a lot of different aspects we're digging into, so I'll let us get right back to Mike. And we started with talking about why the WordPress community is such an important asset and an important factor in making your choice. And the WordPress community is an important asset I think we want to make sure we highlight, because it feels a lot like the Apple community is the one you and I are familiar with. You know, there are a couple other communities we're both part of. It's a very vibrant community. It's a very dedicated community because they work with this program or these sets of programs all the time. They want to see them better. And I feel like again, I'll point to the Apple community. The WordPress they're very welcoming. They're also rather tech oriented, probably a little more so than sometimes a lot of Mac users. But it's a platform that's going to be around for a while because there's a lot of support and frankly a lot of love for it. I think is a fair way to say it.
I think so. I mean, I keep thinking of the phrase that WordPress themselves use, and that is they democratize publishing. And what they define that is, and I actually copied and pasted this because I wanted to make sure I got it right. They define it as the freedom to build, the freedom to change, and the freedom to share. And that sharing ties into the community. And one of the things that WordPress does, and I try to participate in these as much as possible, but there are events held all throughout the country and all throughout the world called WordCamps. And these WordCamps remind me very much of MacStock, by the way. And I would be lying if I said I didn't base some of MacStock on how WordCamps themselves are run. But WordCamps are great because it gives you a place to go and meet and share information with others who are either in the same situation as you, are much more advanced than you, or are just starting out, like maybe you are. And there's no judgment. You know, it's a very open, welcoming community. There's a big one that's held in the U.S. every year. It's called WordCamp US. They move it from location to location throughout the country. They hold it in one location for 2 years in a row. So last year was in St. Louis. The year before was Nashville. It's been held all over the country. Whether it's WordCamp US, there's WordCamp Asia, and thanks or no thanks to the pandemic, I was actually able to attend WordCamp Europe, which just ended a week or two ago now. That was the first virtual conference, and I was able to attend it because it was a virtual conference. And I would be lying if I said I didn't get new ideas from it for not only how to work with my clients and work better with WordPress, or maybe discovered some new plugins, but also, again, this freedom to share using ideas that maybe I can incorporate into MacStock, and especially the virtual MacStock I want to host this summer. But there's also the WordCamps that are held regionally and locally. So those are super important too, because that's how you get to meet your local community of users, many of whom go to the larger WordCamps as well. But that's how you get to meet your local community. And if you're willing to open up and ask and to start conversations with people, you'll find that you will learn a lot. I went to a WooConf, which is the WooCommerce. They're not holding it right at the moment, but I went to that in Seattle. Went to WordCamp US, most of them virtually for travel purposes, but I did go to a couple in person, and then also some regional ones. But you can, because it's not always my style to open up and ask questions. If you are willing to open up and ask questions, it's a very welcoming community. Everyone's willing to share information with you. And even if you're not willing to do that, the lunch table is always a great place to, we talked about democratizing publishing. It's a great way to democratize knowledge, if you will. So sitting around that lunch table and learning what everyone there does, how they use the platform. In many cases, they're not technical people. It is just like MacStock, where you have just regular old end users, and then you have folks who are actually lead developers of apps that we use every day. You'll find that at WordCamps as well. You sit around that table and you meet these people, and what's great about those kind of things, and it's true to a certain extent with the virtual conferences, but what's great about that is you get to meet the person behind the name or behind the Twitter handle, and it really it humanizes them. It humanizes them, and it makes you feel as if you can open up and ask them questions that maybe you wouldn't ask them if you were just asking those questions virtually of that person, because they're up here. How can I possibly ask them this question? And then you find out they're just a regular person like you and I are, and you can open up and you can ask that. So there's that, but then the sessions are always great. There's always good information. They do run multiple tracks, so you have to kind of stay on top of what sessions you want to catch the most. But then those sessions are always available on WordCamp.tv afterward, completely free out there on YouTube and on their website and everything. So the knowledge is out there, and it's all out there because of the community. So, yeah, that was kind of my long-winded way of answering your question. But the community is awesome. A lot of great folks out there, and everyone seems to be willing to share that knowledge and that information.
So let's go a little more nuts and bolts. Let's say that I'm a small business, and I know I need a website. And I've heard a couple things from friends about WordPress, and they work with developers, or maybe they've built their own in a very limited fashion. So where do I start? Should I shop for a developer first? Should I'm going to, for this example, I'm going to say that I'm not geeky enough to think about really doing it myself. But should I shop for a developer? Should I maybe play with it and try to do a little bit of it myself? Do I shop for a website host first? Where would you suggest someone like that start?
Oh, that's a great question, because there's so many different ways I could tackle the answer to that question. And a lot of it depends on who you are as a small business and how much time you have to devote to the project. Now, I mentioned WordPress always talks about democratizing publishing. They also have their famous 5-minute install, and they're not wrong. It's an incredibly quick process. If you have a web server set up, whether it's local in your office or at a hosting company, which is the probably preferred way to do it if you're not willing to monitor that server all the time. But if you have a web server set up and it meets the minimum requirements of WordPress, gosh darn it, if it's not 5 minutes, it's pretty darn close. And you can literally be up and running with a website, a fairly rudimentary website, but you can be up and running with a website in about 5 minutes. And then by the time you tweak it and add a couple pages and start to play around with it, maybe you've got a couple hours invested in it, but you can have something that looks fairly decent from the get-go. So you could do that. You could go with one of the recommended hosting companies, and I probably would suggest that I've had a lot of bad luck with cheap hosting, but it doesn't mean that there can't be inexpensive hosting that's good. Cheap hosting, inexpensive hosting. Two different ways of talking about what might be interpreted as the same thing, but I truly mean it to be two different things.
Okay, so stop right there, folks. Go back, rewind, and listen to that again, because
Did I
there's
say
a
it wrong?
no,
Did I
no,
say it
no,
wrong?
no. You said it absolutely right. There is a big difference between cheap hosting and inexpensive hosting, and I
Mm-hmm.
that congratulations. That's a great point.
Yeah, there's moderate priced hosting. All the great hosting companies, or all the really, really good hosting companies, let's put it that way. All the really, really good hosting companies have an inexpensive tier and they have more expensive tiers. Most small businesses, I would go out on a limb and say most small businesses don't need to worry about those super expensive tiers. They're going to be okay in one of the lower tiered hosting plans if you're going with a decent, well-known, trusted hosting company, and there are several out there. And this could be a whole conversation in itself, whether you're going with shared hosting or dedicated hosting, or you're going to go with managed WordPress or what have you. There's lots and lots of different solutions out there. But really what it comes down to is I look for companies that first and foremost take security seriously. If they're not taking security seriously, all bets are off. I've dealt with hosting companies where you would think that your little slice of hosting on their shared server is protected from the other slices of hosting on that same shared server. That's not the case. And some of them are fairly big names. And some of them are little rinky-dink companies. But I've seen instances where there's absolutely no way that it was a problem with the site itself, but then you find out, oh yeah, they came onto your site by way of this other site that they hacked into. That shouldn't happen in a properly set up server. And a good hosting company makes sure that that doesn't happen. So they take security seriously, and I think that's super important. And then you also want, this one is purely opinion. You want to deal with a hosting company who understands WordPress. Anybody can host WordPress, but you want to deal with a hosting company that understands WordPress and they understand what they need to do to set up the environment properly to host it. And again, there are several great companies out there. WordPress.org, the website for the self-hosted version of WordPress, has some suggestions. They're good suggestions. They're companies I've worked with, and I think you wouldn't necessarily go wrong with any of them. But there are also some very, very good hosting companies that aren't listed there. And so it's good to ask around. If you're not working with someone who knows, then ask around and see. Don't search for top hosting companies. Don't do that. You're not going to get good results. What you're going to get is a top 10 list of affiliate links. That's what you're going to get. But if you can go to one of the trusted WordPress oriented websites out there that actually gives good information, has actually tested this hosting company and actually knows how good they are, that might be a good resource. Or maybe a friend who's running a WordPress site and has had to deal with security issues on company X and unfamiliarity with WordPress with company Z. Talk to people and see who might be a good hosting company. But there's lots of good companies out there. I don't necessarily, for the sake of this conversation, I don't necessarily want to name any because I don't want to leave anybody out. But there are some very good companies who've been around a while. They take WordPress seriously. They take security seriously, and they're reasonably inexpensive. And by that, they always have introductory specials, but on the regular pricing, on the order of 15 to say $30 a month, somewhere in that range is what you might expect to pay for hosting. So, You'll always get an introductory special, but then expect after that to pay somewhere around 15 to 30 bucks a month. Almost everybody offers a free SSL, or TLS really is the right way to refer to it, certificate these days, so that you have that nice lock in the corner of your website. Almost everybody offers that along with the hosting package. Many offer backup programs. Many offer CDNs, content delivery networks, along with it to help speed up your site. So, narrow it down to a couple that sound good to you. Look at their, hate to say this, but look at their bullet points, see what they offer versus the other one, and see if the difference in price, and sometimes no difference in price, is worth it to you. Okay, so that's hosting. Start with a hosting company. Almost all of them, to a T, when you sign up, will automatically install WordPress. They'll automatically create the database for you, and they'll automatically start you out with the option to select from myriad themes to start your site. So that's a great way to go. And you're going to be paying, like I said, 15, 30 bucks a month, and you'll end up with really good hosting and a reasonably decent site. So that's one way to go.
MacVoices is supported by LinkedIn Jobs. Like it or not, the world has changed. Getting the right people in the right jobs is more important than ever, especially when it comes to healthcare and essential worker positions. To help, LinkedIn Jobs is offering free job posts for those job categories to help get them filled quickly. LinkedIn Jobs is where more and more people are going to find the best candidates for their open positions. With over 675 million members, LinkedIn has the reach to get to the people that you need for your company. They screen candidates for the skills and experiences you are looking for and get your job in front of the ones that you really want to see it. To post a healthcare or essential services job for free, or if you're in another industry and have hiring needs, visit linkedin.com/MacVoices. That's linkedin.com/MacVoices. Terms and conditions apply. Again, linkedin.com/MacVoices to post a healthcare or essential services job for free. Thanks to LinkedIn for everything they do and for their support of MacVoices. MacPaw, the maker of Queen My Mac X, is sponsoring this edition of MacVoices. Queen My Mac X is the all-in-one file cleaning and optimizing tool for the Mac. There are others, but none are as trusted as Queen My Mac X. In one fell swoop, Queen My Mac X scans your system for outdated files with the System Junk feature and also delivers information on your Mac storage space. That's 2 utilities right there, but that's not all. You're not going to wonder what you're doing because Queen My Mac X supports a simple interface, letting you know what you're doing and what you're going to do next, so there are no missteps or surprises. And Queen My Mac X keeps you updated with information on your Mac's CPU load, available RAM, free space, and more. Visit macpaw.com/podcast to download Queen My Mac X today and use the coupon code MacVoices to receive 5% off. Upon visiting macpaw.com/podcast, click the Buy Now button, then scroll to the bottom of your screen to enter the code before completing your purchase. Queen My Mac X is also now available in the Apple App Store. That's macpaw.com/podcast, macpaw.com/podcast, to download your copy of Queen My Mac X and save 5% with the code MacVoices. Do it now and get your Mac up to speed. Thanks to MacPaw for supporting MacVoices. Okay, and I'm going to stop you there for. Well, I'm going to stop you for a second because I want to make sure, folks. Mike did it. I'm going to do the same thing. I mean, we've represented hosting companies here on MacVoices. We will continue to. I don't want to name any because I don't want you to think that it's biased one direction or the other. I have my site on a particular hosting company, and I'm really happy with them. I'm not going to plug them either because we don't want to leave anything out. I want to add one thing to Mike's list, though, and that is service. Because we're talking about you have a web developer, but he's going to be a developer. He's not running, unless he happens to be running his own server. He's not going to run that hosting server, and so you want to make sure that your hosting company is. If you're a restaurant and you depend on that to get orders, yeah, you want super responsive. If you just have something up as a hobby, maybe it's not quite as important.
Right.
But the hosting company I'm with, if I email them, I get something back in 5 minutes, if that, 24/7, 365. And that is
Right.
absolutely worth a little more money to me. So also add to Mike's list service. Mike, though, you mentioned WordPress.org, and I wanted to ask you about that because that's another place to get started. But what do you see as advantages or disadvantages to WordPress.org before we get off the hosting issue?
Well, that was actually where I was going to go next, because it's a little confusing if you're not familiar with it, but there's WordPress.com and there's WordPress.org. They don't lead to the same. Sorry, you weren't hearing that, were you?
No.
That was my phone ringing. It
Oh.
was coming through my headset. I wanted to make sure it wasn't feeding through to you. Sorry about that. There's WordPress.com and there's WordPress.org. In a normal world, you might think they both lead to the same website, and they don't. They lead to two entirely different services from the same company. And WordPress.com is a great way to start out if you just kind of want to get your feet wet, or you want to start out with a fairly simple site, and then move on to something bigger later, because they're essentially a managed. I'll use the term managed hosting service for a free WordPress website. Now, what you're going to end up with is whatever name you come up with .wordpress.com. But you can associate a domain name with it if you opt to pay them a small fee per year. And it literally is a small fee. I think it's somewhere on the order of 15 to 20 bucks a year. It's really inexpensive. And you can associate a domain name with your website. But if you just kind of want to get started, you just kind of want to see what WordPress is all about, you're not too worried about expanding your site that much in the foreseeable future, WordPress.com might be a good place to start, just to kind of see what WordPress is all about. You literally go there. You can sign up for a free site within minutes. You'll have an account, a username, a password, and a migratesite.wordpress.com, and you're off to the races. And you can pick from hundreds of themes. It's limited in plugins. That's one of the disadvantages of it. But that's also part of their ability to manage it. For as many people as have free sites on WordPress.com, they need to be able to ensure that it's a secure environment for all their users. And one way to do that is limit the number of plugins that you can install. So that's one of the disadvantages of it. But the big advantage is that you can start out with it. You can start out with it, build a fairly decent website, and then when you're ready, move to the self-hosted solution. By migrating your site away from WordPress.com, it's already a WordPress site, and moving to the self-hosted solution, which is what you get at WordPress.org, you can then take this site you started with, move it to a self-hosted solution. And by self-hosted, I mean not hosted on WordPress.com. In other words, hosted at a hosting company or hosted on your own server. That's self-hosted. You can take what you have over here, move it over here, and then build upon it, and really not lose a thing. And that's the beauty of it. That's something that you can't do with some of the closed systems. And again, I'm not going to name names, but there are several closed systems out there that you can sign up for, and you can pay a monthly fee. They're not using open source code, and you don't really own your site. They own your site. When you stop paying the monthly fee, your site goes away. If you didn't take care to back everything up, it's lost. You don't own a thing when you work with one of those sites. And that's something that you do get with WordPress, and you do get with WordPress.com even, is that 100% control of your site. And that's a big disadvantage of those web builder sites, is that if you hit a wall, let's say you're working with their e-commerce solution and you hit a wall and you want to add some functionality to it that they just don't offer, you can't do it. You can only do what they offer. You can only make design changes within the limits that they impose upon you. even if you decide that their hosting is not up to snuff, you can't pick up your site and move it elsewhere because, again, you don't own your site. With WordPress, whether it's WordPress.com or WordPress.org, or let's go back to 1996 and it's your hand-coded site or the early MacVoices, which is a hand-coded site. You own that content, and you can literally pick it up and move it wherever you want to. And that's the case with WordPress. Is if you're unhappy with your hosting company or you're unhappy with your developer or whatever, you can take that code and pick it up and move it somewhere else because you own that code. And I love that about it.
Agreed. And that's a great point that I've honestly kind of forgot to mention or write into my outline, that you need to be aware, because your content, it's your content, but they're not going to maintain it for you. And I think some of them are getting better, that they're letting you export things out. But if you've been dependent on their hooks and the niceties built into their system, even though you get that content out, you're almost going to have to recreate everything from scratch. I mean,
or do a lot of copying and pasting.
A whole lot, yeah.
Oftentimes that you can get the content out. It's like Google Takeout, or it's like any of these other Facebook's export feature. It's great to have all this content, but now what do I do with all these XML files and all this stuff? If you don't have a way to work with that content, it's pretty useless to you. Now, again, fortunately, WordPress does have import tools for a lot of these proprietary systems. So if you can export your content, very often you can get it into WordPress specifically. And I'm sure you can get it into some of the other open source platforms. I mentioned Drupal and Joomla, and certainly you could get it into a hand-coded site. But it's going to take some work, and there's a little bit of pain. And in some cases, there's a lot of pain. I helped a client move from a proprietary e-commerce solution to a WordPress solution, and oh my gosh, it was just weeks and weeks of hand manipulating the data. We had all the data, we could export the data, but then manipulating it to get it to a usable format that we could import into anything was a nightmare. I actually had to hire a friend of mine to help me go through all this data just to get it to a point where we could use it. It was crazy. I'm not saying that's the case with all of them, but that can be the case with a takeout type service where you're exporting your data. It's often exported in a way that's not terribly usable.
Right. Okay, so I've got my hosting company. I may, at this point, maybe I haven't hired a developer. I want to play with it a little myself. So I've got my hosting company and I've got WordPress installed. My next thing I think that I'm going to want to do is I'm going to want to try to decide how it looks. And so that means themes.
Themes, yeah.
And themes, it took me a little while to understand that themes not only make it look nice, but themes also can present some security issues. And not that the developer of the theme is going to, is insecure, but if it's not well developed and maintained, there can be holes. So any tips for picking out themes, both from a security standpoint and from a function standpoint?
Yeah. So this, boy, you asked me, maybe we want to talk about the types of plugins I use or the types of themes I use and things like that. I do try as much as possible to standardize on certain plugins and certain theme frameworks as much as possible. And there's a reason for it. One of the reasons is trust. I trust these developers. Sometimes I have an investment. I invest in purchasing licenses to their themes because I know that they've been around for a while, that they take development seriously, they take security issues seriously, and I know that they're responsive when there is a problem, that it'll be patched. And that is a case where I know the license fees that I pay are going for a good purpose. And the same is true for plugins. I will make an investment in certain plugins, whether it's a form engine or whether it's a security plugin or what have you, because I know that the developers behind it take it seriously. They treat it like a business. And that's super important. There's hobby developers and there's developers who treat what they're doing like the business it should be treated. And those are the ones I like to support with license fees. So yeah, I standardize on certain plugins because I have licenses to them, but I also standardize on certain plugins because I can trust it. And that's probably the number one reason I might use or suggest a plugin, is because I know it's going to be secure, or it's going to have the functionality. Security is one thing, or it's going to have the functionality that I need, or I know that the developer is listening to users and incorporating new functionality as users request it. Those kind of things are important. An active development team behind it is super important. I know that didn't really answer your question, but when looking at themes, there's a very small subset of themes that I look at personally when I'm helping someone develop a site. That doesn't mean that that's the be all and end all, but one of the things that the themes and frameworks, we're expanding the concept of content management systems a little bit. You mentioned CMS earlier, and a CMS is in a very basic, rudimentary way of describing it. You've got the engine that drives the site. In this particular case, for purposes of our conversation, it's the WordPress core. That's the engine that drives the site. You have a database, you have content, you have theming, and all those things are pulled together within milliseconds. When someone visits your site, the engine fires up, it pulls the content from the database that it needs to display on the site. It pulls the design elements from the theme that it needs on the site. It integrates the plugins that you've incorporated into the site. It does this all in milliseconds to display the page that we're presented with when you visit that site. But then some themes use what I call a framework, so that the framework is actually the theme. And then on top of that, there are what are referred to as child themes that sit on top of that framework. So you have the framework, the theme, and then you got the child themes. And in some cases, the framework and the child theme are kind of intermixed. And I find that more in what are called page builders. And a page builder is where you have kind of drag and drop functionality in the pages that you're working on, or the posts that you're working on within WordPress. So there's all these different concepts. They all kind of mean the same thing. They all mean themes, or they all mean plugins, but sometimes that concept can be within itself expanded quite a lot, either to a framework and child theme, or a framework and page builder, and what have you. All right. So the themes that I use and the themes I standardize don't tend to incorporate a lot of other third-party tools and plugins and things like that. Where I see sites getting into trouble with themes is when they go out to one of these, and they're very wonderful sites that you can go, and a lot of independent developers contribute their themes, or they contribute their artwork, or they contribute their music or videos or things like that, and you can buy licenses to these, and you can buy the license to use this object that they've developed, whether it be code or artwork or fonts or what have you, and you can pay to license it and use it in your own projects. Well, a lot of the themes that are on these sites do something that I don't like, and that is that they build other third-party plugins into their theme to give it enhanced functionality. And when they do that, they incorporate this code, usually as a zip file, into a subfolder of their theme. And then when you install the theme, it says, oh, do you want to install these other plugins? And then it installs them from that subdirectory. It doesn't install it from the original source. So you end up with what are sometimes outdated plugins and features, and then in many cases, not all cases, but in many cases, you're beholden to that theme developer to make sure that those plugins are kept up to date, because that theme developer has paid a developer's license for that plugin to incorporate it into the theme. So that's where it can get messy. When you come across a theme that has a third-party page builder or third-party plugin, which might otherwise be great, but you can't necessarily, in many cases you can, but you can't necessarily trust that developer to ensure that you, the end user, are always being kept up to date. And sometimes that you can run into security problems. So I urge caution with that, but you're never going to find that in the WordPress repository of themes. You're going to find themes there. You're not going to find themes that incorporate a bunch of third-party plugins. You're not going to find plugins that pull in content. They're very well vetted in the WordPress repository on WordPress.org, where you can download themes or you can download plugins. And this is all accessible from the back end of WordPress. So starting with the themes and plugins that are available through WordPress, think of it as the Mac App Store of WordPress. These are the maybe not quite as well vetted as Apple vets the apps that are available through the Mac App Store and the iOS app stores, but still looked at nonetheless. And if there are problems, there's somebody there to leap on that problem and pull something that's dangerous from that repository. It doesn't always happen as quickly as some in the community would like it. It doesn't always happen as quickly as I would like it. And sometimes plugins and themes are allowed to languish out there much longer than they should. But fortunately, there are third-party companies that also look into the repository and report issues back to WordPress when they find them. And that's again, part of this community and part of this open source ecosystem that we have, is that there's a lot of eyes on these things to make sure, unlike Apple, where there's one set of eyes, if you will, it's Apple's eyes looking over the apps that are submitted. With open source projects, there's thousands of eyes that are looking after it. And when something is found, it's very often brought to light pretty quickly. So that, I think if you're just starting out and you've just launched a site and you want to explore themes, going into the themes section of WordPress and exploring what's available through WordPress.org in their repository is a good place to start.
That wraps up part 2 of our discussion with Mike Potter about WordPress. Part 3 and the final section is coming up on the next edition of MacVoices. I hope you'll join us then. As always, thanks for watching. Visit MacVoices.com for show notes and to connect with Chuck on social media. Get involved in our Facebook group or like our Facebook page, and get more out of your Apple tech with MacVoices Magazine, free on Flipboard and on the web. And if you find value in it all, consider supporting us through either our Patreon campaign at patreon.com/MacVoices or by making a one-time donation via the PayPal link on our front page and in the show notes of each episode. You will join these fine people who help bring you MacVoices. Advertising handled by Backbeat Media at backbeatmedia.com. Bandwidth provided by CacheFly at cachefly.com.